You know, I've been around these parts for the better part of 80 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the good Lord had to offer. But there was one morning, back in the spring of 1885, that'd be 1885, mind you, that changed everything I believed about wild creatures and the folks brave enough to love them. It happened in Cedar Ridge, a little frontier town nestled up against the Colorado mountains. I was just a boy then, helping my pa at the general store. But what I witnessed that day has stayed with me clearer than yesterday's breakfast. Some folks say animals are just beasts, driven by hunger and instinct. But I'm here to tell you different. This is the story of Margaret Whitehorse, a Cherokee widow who taught our whole town that sometimes the wildest hearts are the ones that remember kindness the longest. The crash came like thunder through a clear sky, splintering wood and the shriek of twisted metal. Margaret Whitehorse looked up from her herb garden, sage leaves crumbling between her weathered fingers. The morning smelled of dew and wood smoke from breakfast fires, that comfortable smell every frontier town wore like an old coat. But now something else rode the air. Fear, sharp as lye soap. "Lord have mercy!" Jeb Turner came tearing down Main Street like his britches were on fire, his Sunday shirt torn clear through at the shoulder. "Get inside! Get the young'uns inside!" Margaret stood slow. Her 62-year-old knees weren't what they used to be, and the damp mornings didn't help none. The sage fell forgotten to the dirt. Without thinking, her right hand went to her left forearm, fingers finding those old raised scars through the thin cotton of her work dress. 4 lines, thick as pencil marks, running wrist to elbow. Turner bent over double, right there in the street, gasping like a landed fish. The man's face had gone white as fresh laundered sheets. "Mountain cat!" He could barely get the words out. Big as a full-grown steer! Yellow eyes like lantern light!" Margaret watched the younger man's panic with a face folks might mistake for calm, but her fingers pressed harder against those scars, and her dark eyes stayed fixed on the tree line where the pines stood thick and green. Sheriff Caldwell came out of his office, Winchester in hand. The morning sun caught the barrel, making it gleam like a promise of violence. "Where exactly, Jeb?" "By my milk shed, just standing there, watching me milk Bessie." Turner swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Never seen nothing that big. Had scars all over its face and half its left ear was missing, torn clean off like somebody took shears to it." The sage in Margaret's garden seemed to dance in the breeze. Or maybe her eyes weren't focusing right. Her throat had gone dry as August dust, the kind that made you cough just thinking about it. "How long ago?" Caldwell was already checking his rifle, the click-click of the mechanism loud in the morning quiet. "Not 5 minutes past. It just looked at me, then turned and walked into the trees, slow as you please, like it was out for a Sunday stroll." Mrs. Johnson appeared in her doorway, clutching her 2 boys so tight they squirmed. "Is it gone? Dear Lord in heaven, is it gone?" "Everyone inside," Caldwell ordered. "Turner, you and Doc Hartley round up the men. We're going hunting." Margaret found herself walking forward, her moccasins, the soft deerskin ones her grandmother had taught her to make, silent on the packed earth of Main Street. "Hold on there, John!" Every head turned to her. She could smell their fear now, sour as spoiled milk. "You say it just looked at you?" Her voice carried that soft Cherokee cadence her late husband had said sounded like creek water over stones. Turner nodded, quick and nervous. "Like it was studying on something, deciding." "And it walked away? Didn't run?" "That's what made it worse, ma'am. It moved like it owned the place. Like we were visitors in its parlor." Margaret's hand dropped from her arm. She looked at the gathering crowd, neighbors she'd known for 7 years, since she'd come to Cedar Ridge after Thomas passed. Good folks, most of them. Salt of the earth, as her mother used to say. But frightened folks did foolish things, sure as sunrise. A mountain lion that size, bold enough to walk through a ranch in broad daylight? It's either sick, starving, or She paused, choosing her words careful as picking berries around thorns. Or it knows something we don't. What in tarnation is that supposed to mean? Caldwell's voice had an edge sharper than his skinning knife. Before she could answer, young Timothy Brennan tugged at her skirt. The 8-year-old's eyes were wide as saucers, that mix of fear and excitement only children could manage. Mrs. Whitehorse, are we going to die? She looked down at the boy. Sandy hair that wouldn't stay combed, gap where his front tooth had come out last week. For just a moment, she smiled. No, child. Death doesn't announce itself with such politeness. When death comes calling, it doesn't knock first. Margaret's got a point, Doc Hartley said, limping out of his clinic with his own hunting rifle. That old war wound from Gettysburg always acted up when weather was changing. Healthy mountain lions don't typically approach settlements, not in broad daylight. Then it's rabid, someone called out. Sounded like Patterson from the feed store. That's even worse! Did it seem rabid to you, Mr. Turner? Margaret asked quietly. Turner thought for a moment, his face screwing up with concentration. No, ma'am. It seemed... I don't rightly know how to say it. Deliberate. Like it was looking for something particular. A chill ran down Margaret's spine despite the warming sun. She turned toward the mountains, where morning shadows still pooled purple and deep between the pines. Somewhere up there, among the granite peaks and hidden valleys where even trappers didn't venture, secrets waited. Sheriff, might I suggest waiting? If that cat wanted to hurt someone, Mr. Turner would not be standing here telling us about it. You defending that beast? Mrs. Johnson's voice pitched high and sharp. I'm suggesting we think before we act. My grandmother always said, fast hands make slow amends. Your grandmother wasn't facing down a mountain lion, Patterson grumbled. Margaret wanted to tell them they were wrong, wanted to explain that some bonds run deeper than species, that memory lives in more than just the mind. But the words stuck in her throat like pine pitch. The morning had gone eerily quiet. Even the sparrows had stopped their chatter. In the distance, she could hear the creek running low. They'd need rain soon. But closer, right there in the center of town, she could hear something else. The soft whisper of wind through fur, the nearly silent pad of massive paws on hard-packed earth. She turned, slow as molasses in January, toward the alley between the bank and the barber shop. There, just visible in the shadows, a pair of golden eyes watched them all. The mountain lion hadn't left. It had circled back. Before we continue, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Margaret's fingers fumbled with the brass latch on her old trunk. The metal had gone green around the edges, tarnished from years of mountain humidity. Behind her, through the thin pine walls of her cabin, Caldwell's voice carried clear, organizing the hunting party, dividing up the trails. The lid creaked open. Musty air hit her face, leather and dried herbs and something else that made her throat tighten. Memory had a smell, turned out, like old blood and hope mixed together. Her hands found the bundle without looking. Oilcloth, yellowed and cracking at the folds. The weight familiar even after 5 years. Inside, wrapped in her old calico dress, the one with tiny yellow flowers she'd worn that autumn day, lay the bone needle. 3 inches of carved deer antler, one end stained dark brown. The cabin door rattled on its hinges. Mrs. Whitehorse? Timothy's voice, high and breathless. My ma says come to the saloon. Sheriff's calling everyone. She pressed the needle against her palm until the point drew a bead of blood. Still sharp. Tell them I'm coming, child. Small feet pattered away across her porch, making the loose board by the door squeak. The calico dress unfolded in her lap, releasing the smell of cedar from the trunk. The hem was ruined. Blood had set into the fabric, permanent as ink. Not her blood. She lifted the fabric and breathed deep. Even now, beneath the cedar, she could smell it. Wild musk, pine sap, and the copper tang of fear. Margaret stood, tucking the bone needle into her medicine pouch. The weight of it pulled at her belt. Outside, she could hear folks hurrying toward the saloon. Boots on boardwalks, mothers calling children, doors slamming. The walk to Main Street took her past Turner's property. There in the dust, tracks. Round, 4 toes visible, big as tea saucers. She knelt, her knees grinding against the dirt, and spread her fingers inside one print. Her whole hand fit with room to spare around the edges. The saloon doors were already swinging when she arrived. Voices crashed against each other like spring floodwater. "Hire a professional hunter from Denver. Poison bait along the ridge. My children won't be safe to fetch water." Mayor Hutchins banged a pewter mug on the bar hard enough to slosh whiskey. "Order! Mrs. Whitehorse, good. We need everyone here." She took a position near the wall where both doors stayed visible. The room reeked of stale beer, tobacco juice, and fresh fear sweat. "Jake Morrison's already on his way," Hutchins announced. "Best tracker in 3 states. He'll be here tomorrow noon." Margaret's medicine pouch suddenly weighed heavy as stones. Morrison. She'd heard that name before. The man who'd brought in 17 mountain lion pelts last winter, including cubs. The jerky weighed heavy in Margaret's leather pouch as she picked her way down the narrow trail to Willow Creek. Late afternoon sun slanted through the pines, throwing bars of shadow across the path. Her moccasins found the quiet places between dried leaves and loose stones, muscle memory from years of gathering herbs in these woods. Behind her, Cedar Ridge had gone quiet as a church on Monday. Windows shuttered tight, children pulled indoors before supper. Even the dogs had stopped their barking, like they knew something was coming. The creek gurgled ahead, running low this time of year. She could smell it before she saw it, wet stone and moss, that green smell of willow bark her grandmother used to brew for headaches. The familiar flat boulder sat halfway across the creek, worn smooth by 20 years of spring floods. Same rock where she'd sat nursing Thomas through his last fever, trying to cool him with creek water that couldn't touch the fire burning him up from inside. Margaret studied the opposite bank. Thick buckbrush growing wild. Young aspens with their leaves trembling in the breeze, showing their white undersides like surrender flags. Plenty of cover for something that didn't want to be seen. She waded through the shallow water, cold seeping through the worn soles of her moccasins, numbing her toes. The boulder's surface still held warmth from the day's sun. She settled herself, careful as a bird on eggs, movements slow and deliberate. From the pouch, she withdrew 3 strips of jerky. Venison she'd smoked with juniper berries, same way she'd done it 5 years back, when a wounded creature needed to trust her enough to eat. She laid the meat on a smaller rock 20 paces upstream, far enough to give a wary animal room to approach, close enough for her scent to carry on the evening breeze. The forest held its breath. Even the jays had gone quiet. Margaret's throat felt thick as winter honey. The Cherokee words came anyway, soft as the creek's whisper. Unega Gavladi. White One sleeps. Mountains watch your dreaming. Stars guard your rest. The lullaby her grandmother had taught her for colicky babies, for children burning with fever. She'd sung it for 3 months straight, night after night, while torn muscle knitted itself back together, while trust grew between 2 creatures who had no business trusting each other. A jay screamed somewhere in the canopy. Margaret kept singing, though her voice cracked like old leather. Morning brings the healing. Sun returns your strength. The buckbrush shivered, not from wind. The aspens stood dead still. The smell hit her first. Wild cat musk, pine pitch, and underneath it all, something like sun-warm stone. It filled her nose, coated the back of her throat. Her body wanted to run, every muscle tight as fiddle strings. She pressed her palms flat against the warm rock and kept singing. A branch snapped. Not a small sound. Weight behind it. He emerged between 2 aspens like smoke taking form, and Margaret's breath stuck in her chest. Lord have mercy, he'd grown. What had been a desperate, half-dead yearling was now something magnificent and terrible. Muscle rippled under a tawny coat marked with scars she didn't recognize. Shoulders broad as a barrel. When he stood full height, his head would reach her waist. But the eyes, golden as wheat at harvest time, those she knew. The mountain lion stood at the forest edge, one massive paw raised, frozen mid-step. His head turned slightly, and there it was. The left ear, torn halfway down, healed into a jagged line like the mountain ridges against morning sky. Her fingers remembered the blood, hot and sticky, trying to hold the torn pieces together while he writhed in fever dreams. Margaret kept singing, though her voice had gone thin as October ice. Water knows your sorrow. Wind carries it away. The great cat's good ear swiveled toward her. His nostrils flared, pulling in her scent, reading her like she was a book written in smell. Soap and sage, wood smoke, and the salt of nervous sweat. The raised paw settled to earth. Muscles bunched along his flanks, coiled tight. She forced herself to look at the jerky instead of him. In the corner of her eye, she watched him take one step forward, then another. Each movement fluid as water, dangerous as spring ice. 12 paces from the meat, he stopped. The silence stretched between them, taut as wet rawhide drying in the sun. Margaret's hand moved to her medicine pouch, fingers finding the bone needle. The old bloodstains were rough under her thumb. She'd used it to drain the poison from his leg, back when he'd been small enough to hold, when fever had made him weak enough to let her. "Onega," she whispered. The mountain lion's head snapped toward her. His lips pulled back, showing fangs long as her little finger, yellow as old ivory. Not quite a snarl, not quite a greeting. Something between. Wild thing remembering domesticity, or tame thing remembering wildness. She tried again, louder, putting all 5 years of missing into the word. "Onega, white one." His tail, thick as her arm, swept once across the ground. Leaves scattered in its wake. He padded closer to the meat, but those golden eyes never left her face. At 10 paces, she could see the other scars clear as reading. Claw marks across his muzzle. Territorial fights with other males. A patch of fur on his shoulder that grew in wrong, white against the tawny. Another trap, or maybe a bullet graze. The world had not been kind to him. He lowered his massive head to the jerky, but didn't eat. Just breathed it in, nostrils working. His eyes flicked up to her, then back to the meat. A question in that look, or maybe a memory. Margaret began humming the lullaby again, low in her throat, the way she'd hummed it while cleaning his wounds, while forcing willow bark tea between his teeth. The mountain lion's good ear tracked the sound. His tail swept again, stirring dust that caught the slanted sunlight like flour. He picked up one strip of meat in his jaws, delicate as a mother cat with a kitten. The jerky disappeared in 3 bites, barely chewed. He looked at her again, and for one heartbeat, she saw it clear. The young cat she'd known, scared and hurting, but willing to trust because the alternative was death. That same creature lived behind those golden eyes, buried under 5 years of surviving alone. A rifle shot cracked across the valley, the sound bouncing off the canyon walls like thunder. The mountain lion exploded into motion. One heartbeat he was there, solid as the mountains themselves. The next, only trembling aspens marked where he'd been. The remaining jerky lay untouched on the stone. Margaret's hands shook as she stood. That shot had come from the North Trail. Caldwell's men, probably. They'd found tracks, or thought they'd seen something move in the shadows. She waded back through the creek, water shocking cold against her heated skin, heart still hammering. Halfway up the bank, she stopped. There in the soft earth, pressed deep and clear, his paw print, fresh as just-made butter. But beside it, smaller, more delicate, another set of tracks, following his. Margaret's knees nearly buckled. She grabbed a willow branch to steady herself, bark rough under her palm. Not him alone. Them. A mated pair. And if her eyes weren't lying, if those smaller tracks meant what she thought they meant, the female was either pregnant or nursing cubs. Margaret's wet moccasins squelched against the schoolhouse floor, leaving dark prints on the pine boards. 23 faces turned toward her. Children pressed against the far wall like they were trying to push through it. Sarah Mills standing guard at the locked door with a poker from the wood stove clutched in both hands. "Thank the Lord," Sarah breathed. Her knuckles had gone white as fresh churned butter around that iron rod. "Did you hear the shot?" "The men are hunting." Margaret kept her voice level, though her mind kept circling back to those smaller tracks by the creek. A female, maybe with cubs. No luck yet, seems like. Sarah's hands trembled, making the poker shake. "I was letting them out for lunch recess when Turner's boy came running, screaming about yellow eyes watching from the trees." The children huddled tighter. Little Emma Hutchins had wet herself. Margaret could smell the sharp ammonia mixing with chalk dust and fear sweat. The child's face had gone red as autumn apples with shame. "Miss Mills," 7-year-old James whispered, his voice barely carrying across the room. "Are we going to die?" Sarah's poker wavered like a compass needle searching for north. No, of course not. The sheriff will—" "Children!" Margaret stepped forward, her wet hem dragging across the floor. "Look at me." 23 pairs of eyes fixed on her face, wide, white-rimmed, waiting. "How many of you have seen a barn cat with kittens?" A few hands crept up, tentative as spring shoots. "When the mother cat thinks her babies are in danger, what does she do?" Timothy Brennan's hand shot up straight. "She moves them, carries them in her mouth to somewhere safe." "That's right." Margaret moved to the slate board, picked up a piece of chalk. The stick left white powder on her damp fingers. "And if someone comes between a mother and her babies?" "She scratches." Emma's voice came out thin as thread. "Our Tabby scratched Papa when he tried to touch her kittens." Margaret began sketching on the board. Quick strokes, nothing fancy. The curve of a spine, tucked paws, a tail wrapped protectively around a small body. "This is how I found a mountain lion once. Young, hurt, sleeping." The children crept closer, fear giving way to curiosity. Sarah lowered the poker an inch. "He was no bigger than Mr. Henderson's hunting hound. His leg was caught in a trap." Margaret added details. The torn ear, the closed eyes, the way his ribs showed through matted fur. "He was so scared he couldn't even growl, just laid there shaking." "What did you do?" Timothy asked, already knowing but needing to hear it. "I helped him, same way I'd help any hurt creature." "But mountain lions eat people," James protested, his voice stronger now. Margaret turned from the board, chalk dust floating in the streams of sunlight from the high windows. "How many of you have seen a mountain lion before today?" No hands. "How many of you have heard of someone in Cedar Ridge being eaten by one?" Silence thick as morning porridge. "They're afraid of us. We're strange to them. We smell wrong, sound wrong. They hunt deer, rabbits, things that make sense to them. Not people." She set down the chalk, leaving a white smudge on the desk. "Unless we give them a reason to change their minds." The door handle rattled hard enough to make everyone jump. Sarah raised the poker again. "It's Mrs. Johnson! Open up! Now!" Sarah fumbled with the lock, fingers slipping twice before it clicked. Mrs. Johnson burst through like floodwater through a broken dam, her 2 boys clinging to her skirts. Behind her, more parents crowded the doorway, faces twisted with panic. "We're taking our children home," Mrs. Johnson announced. Her face was splotched red and white like spilled paint. "This school isn't safe. Nowhere's safe with that beast loose." "Now hold on," Sarah started. "No holding on," Mr. Patterson pushed through, carrying an old musket that looked like it hadn't been fired since his grandfather's time. Rust spotted the barrel like age spots on old hands. "My boy isn't staying here to be somebody's dinner." Margaret watched the fear spread through the room like spilled ink across paper. Parents grabbing children, voices rising, overlapping, getting sharper. "The stage is coming!" someone shouted from outside. "Morrison's here!" The crowd surged toward the door, carrying Margaret along like driftwood. She let them push her into the street. The noon stage sat in front of the Western Union office, dust still settling around its wheels in a yellow cloud. The door opened and a man stepped down. Tall, lean as winter beef, wearing a black duster that swept to his boots despite the day's warmth. Jake Morrison. His rifle was unlike anything Cedar Ridge had seen. A Sharps buffalo gun with one of those new telescopic sights, the kind that could drop a man at 500 yards. Or a mountain lion at 300. Morrison's eyes swept the crowd, counting, measuring, cataloging. They were pale as February ice, and when they found Margaret, they lingered. "Where's the cat?" His voice was flat as Kansas prairie, no emotion in it at all. Sheriff Caldwell pushed through the crowd, hat in hand like he was meeting royalty. "In the hills. We heard it this morning. Found tracks by Turner's place." "Just one?" Margaret's stomach clenched like a fist. "Far as we can tell," Caldwell said. Morrison nodded once, adjusted the rifle on his shoulder with practiced ease. "I'll need to see the tracks, fresh ones, and I'll need a room, 3 meals a day, and $50 when I bring you the pelt." "$75 if you get it by tomorrow night," Mayor Hutchins called out, his voice high with desperation. Morrison smiled. It was just his mouth moving. Those pale eyes stayed cold as creek stones. "I'll have it done by dawn." The crowd murmured approval, the sound washing over Margaret like distant thunder. Parents clutched their children tighter, but with relief now instead of just fear. Margaret moved through them quiet as smoke, keeping to the edges. At the crowd's fringe, Timothy caught her sleeve with sticky fingers. "Mrs. Whitehorse, you look scared." She glanced down at the boy. His eyes were old for 8, the kind that saw things adults tried to hide. "Morrison's the best," Timothy continued, but his voice dropped to barely a whisper. "My pa told me he killed a whole family of wolves up in Wyoming last winter. Even the pups. Said he got $5 each for the little ones." Ice formed in Margaret's chest, spreading out through her ribs. She looked back at Morrison, who was examining tracks in the dust with the sheriff, going down on one knee, fingers tracing the prints like he was reading scripture. "Timothy," she said quietly, "would you like to learn something?" The boy nodded, quick as a bird pecking grain. "Come to my cabin after supper. Tell your mother you're helping me prepare medicines for the Thompson baby's croup." "Is this about the mountain lion?" She squeezed his small shoulder, feeling the bird bones beneath his thin shirt. "It's about understanding what others don't." The afternoon crawled by like it was walking through molasses. Margaret went from house to house with her basket of herbs. Chamomile for Mrs. Patterson's nerves that had her hands shaking like aspen leaves. Valerian root for old Mr. Clayton, who couldn't stop pacing his porch. At each stop, she listened to their fears, offered what comfort she could. "I saw it once before," she told them. "Not a lie, not the whole truth. It stayed away from town then. It will again if we don't provoke it." But through every window, she could see Morrison working. The man moved like a machine, all purpose and no wasted motion. Studying angles, checking wind direction, examining every track, every broken twig. He found the path to the creek, both sets of prints, though he said nothing about the smaller ones to anyone. Margaret watched him crouch there for a long time, fingers tracing the edges of the prints, reading the story they told. As the sun dropped toward the mountains, painting them purple as fresh bruises, she stood in her garden, crushing lavender between her palms. The oil released its scent, sweet and sharp, but it couldn't mask the fierce stink of the town, or her own cold sweat. Morrison appeared at her fence gate like he'd materialized from shadow. Up close, she could see the scars on his hands, curved white lines, bite marks that had healed badly. "Ma'am?" He touched his hat brim with 2 fingers. "Heard you've been telling folks not to worry." "I've been telling them to think clearly. Same thing that gets people killed." He studied her with those pale eyes, unblinking as a snake. "You know something about this cat." Not a question, a statement, flat as hammered iron. Margaret met his gaze steady. "I know that fear makes people dangerous. So do mountain lions." He pulled something from his pocket, a tuft of tawny fur caught on a thorn bush. "This was at the creek. But you already knew that, didn't you? Your tracks were all over that boulder. Fresh tracks. Today's tracks. The lavender oil made her palms slick. She could feel it between her fingers, sweet and bitter at once. I often gather herbs there. Morrison stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the gun oil on his coat, the tobacco on his breath, the leather of his boots. There's 2 of them, male and female. You know what that means? Margaret's vision narrowed to Morrison's scarred hands, to the way his fingers moved unconsciously, like they were already pulling a trigger. Means they're breeding, he continued, his voice still flat, emotionless. Or already have. Could be a whole den of cubs up there. His smile returned, cold as winter morning. 75 for the male. Town'll pay the same for the female. 20 each for cubs. The lavender stem snapped in Margaret's fist, sharp ends digging into her palm. Morrison touched his hat again. I'll start at first light. Should have pelts for you by noon. He walked away, boot falls heavy on the packed earth, each step deliberate as a coffin nail being driven home. Margaret looked down at her hands. Green pulp and oil stained her palms, dark in the fading light. In the shadows, it looked like blood. A small sound made her turn. The general store smelled of pickle brine and coal oil when Margaret pushed through the door, making the little brass bell jangle like it was announcing Sunday service. 8 people clustered around the penny candy jars, not shopping, just needing to be near each other the way cattle bunch up before a storm. Their voices died quick as snuffed candles when she entered. Mrs. Clayton clutched a tin of baking powder she didn't need, turning it over and over in her hands. Margaret, we were just wondering if I've lost my mind? Margaret moved to the counter, where Sam Briggs stood polishing the same spot he'd been working since yesterday, the wood worn smooth as glass under his rag. Nobody said that, but Sam's eyes slid away from hers like butter on a hot pan. Timothy sat on a flour barrel near the window, legs swinging, heels drumming against the wood in a nervous rhythm. His mother stood beside him, one hand protective on his shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to wrinkle his shirt. Mrs. Whitehorse was teaching us about barn cats, the boy announced, his voice bright as new pennies. How they're scared of us, too. His mother's fingers tightened till Timothy squirmed. Timothy, that's different. Is it? Margaret picked up a jar of horehound candy, watching the amber pieces catch the late afternoon light through the glass. Each piece glowed like captured sunshine. Fear's fear. Doesn't matter if it's got whiskers or claws or goes on 2 legs. Doc Hartley limped in from the back room where he kept medical supplies, that old war wound making him list to the left. His medical bag thumped soft against the counter. Margaret's got a point. Animals don't attack without reason. Since when are you an expert on mountain lions, Doc? Patterson's voice had an edge sharp enough to shave with. Hartley set his bag down gentle, the leather creaking. I'm not. But I know Margaret Whitehorse. He looked around the room, meeting each pair of eyes. Remember the winter of '79, when half this town had lung fever? Uncomfortable shifting, boots scraping wood floor. The pickle barrel's lid creaked as someone leaned against it. She went house to house in that blizzard. 3 feet of snow, wind that'd freeze your spit before it hit the ground. Hartley's eyes found Margaret's. Made that tea. Bitter as sin and smelled like boiled socks. But it worked. You learned that from your Cherokee grandmother, didn't you? Margaret nodded, remembering the weight of snow on her shoulders, the way her fingers had gone numb mixing herbs, the rattle in so many chests that winter. She saved my boy, Mrs. Brennan said quietly from her corner by the fabric bolts. Timothy wouldn't be here without her. That's doctoring, not wild animals, Patterson countered, but his voice had lost some of its edge. Margaret set down the candy jar with a soft clink. My grandmother taught me both, how to heal, how to watch, how to see what others miss. She moved to the window where Timothy sat. Outside, shadows stretched long as winter nights across Main Street. Morrison stood at the hotel entrance, cleaning his rifle with steady, practiced strokes, the metal gleaming like a promise. Tell them about the wolves, Timothy whispered, bouncing slightly on his barrel. Margaret looked down at him, eyebrows raised like question marks. You told me once about the wolves your grandmother knew, the ones that didn't eat the dead people. The room had gone church quiet. Even Sam stopped polishing. Margaret turned from the window. When I was Timothy's age, maybe a hair younger, a pack of wolves lived near our village. Big timber wolves, with yellow eyes like harvest moons. Mrs. Clayton's hand went to her throat, fingers finding the cross she wore. Every winter, they'd come closer. We'd hear them at night, singing to each other across the valleys. See their tracks in the morning snow, big as saucers. Margaret moved to the center of the room, her moccasins silent on the worn floorboards. The men wanted to hunt them, put out poison bait, but my grandmother said no. Why? Timothy asked, though he knew the answer, needed the others to hear it. Because she watched them, learned their ways. The wolves only hunted the old deer, the sick ones. They kept the herd strong, like a gardener pulling weeds. Margaret's fingers found the medicine pouch at her hip, leather worn smooth from years of touching. One winter, sickness came to the village, bad sickness, the kind that turns strong men into shadows. Many died. The clock on the wall ticked loud as heartbeats in the silence. We put the bodies on platforms, the old way, away from the village, for the sky to take them. She looked at each face in turn, seeing fear and fascination mixed like oil and water. The wolves never touched them. Could have. Easy meat, no danger. But they walked around our dead, left them in peace. That's... Patterson started, then stopped, mouth hanging open like a landed fish. My grandmother said the wolves understood grief, respected it. Said any creature that could recognize sorrow in another species had a soul worth protecting. Doc Hartley cleared his throat, the sound rough as sandpaper. What do you think it wants then, this mountain lion? Margaret hesitated, weighing words like flour on a scale. The weight of Timothy's eager gaze pressed against her. Maybe it remembers something, she said carefully, each word measured. Animals have long memories, especially about places where significant things happened to them, where they found food, where they found pain, where they found... She paused. Kindness. The bell above the door jangled harsh as breaking glass. Morrison stepped in, bringing the smell of gun oil and leather, cold evening air swirling around him like smoke. His pale eyes swept the room, lingered on Margaret longer than comfortable. Evening, folks. He moved to the counter with that purposeful walk, like every step was planned 3 moves ahead. Need ammunition. 45-70. Box of 20. Sam's hands shook slightly as he reached for the shells, fumbling with the box. It rattled when he set it down, bullets shifting like bones. Morrison counted out coins, precise as a banker. The silver clinked on the wood. Then he looked at Margaret. You were saying? About animal memory? Just stories. She kept her voice level as poured cream. Old Cherokee stories. Morrison pocketed the ammunition, the box disappearing into his coat, smooth as water. In my experience, the only thing animals remember is hunger and pain. Make sure they remember enough pain, they don't come back. Timothy's mother pulled him closer, arm tight around his shoulders. Morrison touched his hat brim, 2 fingers like a mockery of blessing. I'll be starting before dawn. Best keep your children inside until I'm done. The door closed behind him with another jangle. Nobody moved for a long moment, frozen like a tableau in a picture book. I should get Timothy home, Mrs. Brennan finally said, her voice thin as autumn ice. Can I still come tonight? Timothy looked up at Margaret, eyes bright with need. For the medicine lessons? His mother frowned, lines creasing her forehead. I don't think... Please, Ma. Mrs. Whitehorse promised to teach me about... He glanced at Margaret, quick as a hummingbird. About herbs, for helping people. Let him come, Margaret said. I'll walk him home after. Safe as houses. Mrs. Brennan hesitated, looking from her son's eager face to Margaret's steady gaze. 1 hour, no longer. As the store emptied, folks drifting away like smoke, Margaret bought dried beans she didn't need and a twist of tobacco for offerings. Sam took her money without meeting her eyes, his fingers careful not to touch hers when he handed back the change. Night fell fast in the mountains, dropping like a curtain between one breath and the next. By the time Timothy knocked on her door, 3 quick raps like a woodpecker, stars had spilled across the sky thick as spilled salt. She let him in, noting how he kept glancing over his shoulder, eyes white in the darkness. "Nobody followed me," he whispered, though the nearest house was 50 yards away. "Good." She handed him her gathering basket, the woven willow creaking slightly. "We're going to need more jerky." His eyes widened till she could see white all around. "We're going out? But Mr. Morrison is watching the North Ridge. We're going to the creek." "To see him? The mountain lion?" Margaret wrapped her wool shawl around her shoulders, the one Thomas had bought her their last Christmas together. "Maybe, maybe not, but either way, you're going to learn something." They slipped out the back door, keeping to shadows dark as spilled ink. The town lay quiet, windows glowing yellow with lamplight. Somewhere a baby cried, quickly hushed. A dog barked once, then stopped like it had been kicked. The path to the creek was black under the trees, the kind of dark that pressed against your eyes. Margaret moved by memory and feel, one hand on Timothy's shoulder to guide him. His breathing came quick and shallow, like a rabbit's. "Breathe from your belly," she murmured, her voice barely louder than the wind in the pines. "Like I taught you when you had the croup. Fear lives in shallow breath. Courage lives deep." The creek whispered ahead, water talking to stones in a language older than words. Starlight turned the water silver black, like mercury running over rock. Margaret led Timothy to a cluster of willows 20 yards from her usual boulder, their drooping branches making a natural blind. "Sit. Don't move. Don't speak." She pressed the basket into his hands, the handle still warm from her grip. "Watch." She waded to the boulder, each step careful to minimize splashing. The cold bit through her moccasins, numbing her feet quick as frostbite. The stone still held a trace of the day's warmth, like an ember buried in ash. She laid out 6 strips of jerky in a line, then settled herself cross-legged. The lullaby came easier tonight, flowing like creek water. "Unega gavladi." Mountains, watch your dreaming. A great horned owl called from upstream, the sound raising gooseflesh on her arms. Cricket song pulsed in the grass like 1,000 tiny heartbeats. "Stars guard your rest." The buckbrush rustled, louder than last time, confident. Timothy made a small sound in the willows, quickly stifled, like a hand over his mouth. Unega emerged from the same spot as before, but faster this time, flowing across the ground like poured honey. No hesitation. His massive form moved straight to the meat, muscles rolling under his coat like water under ice. Margaret kept singing, watching him eat. Each strip disappeared in 2 bites, barely chewed. When he finished, he did something that stopped her breath. He sat. Actually sat like a house cat, tail wrapped around his paws, and looked at her. She reached into her pouch, drew out 3 more strips. Instead of placing them on the rock, she held them out in her open palm. Unega's ears flattened against his skull. "I know," she whispered. "It's been so long. But you remember, don't you? Remember this hand? This smell?" The mountain lion rose, took 2 steps forward, stopped. His tail swept once, twice, stirring leaves. On the 3rd sweep, he moved again. 1 pace, another. 10 feet, 8, 6. Margaret's arm trembled, but she kept it extended, steady as she could manage. 4 feet. She could smell him now. Wildcat and pine forest, and something underneath like sun-warmed stone. His breath huffed out in little puffs, visible in the cool air. He stretched his neck forward, whiskers brushing her fingers light as spider silk. The meat disappeared from her palm, his rough tongue scraping her skin just once. A twig snapped in the willows. Unega's head whipped around, lips pulling back from his fangs, a growl rolling up from deep in his chest. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs hard enough to hurt. "It's all right," she said quickly, though her voice shook. "Just a boy, like you were, young and watching." The mountain lion's growl vibrated through the air, through the stone, through Margaret's bones. But he didn't run. Instead, he looked back at her, then toward the willows, then at her again. Understanding passed between them, clear as spoken words. He knew Timothy was there, had known all along. "He won't hurt you," Margaret called softly. "Timothy, stand up, slow as molasses." The boy rose from the willows like a small ghost, his face white as fresh milled flour in the starlight, eyes so wide she could see the whites all around. Unega watched him for a long moment. Then, deliberately, he turned his back on the child. He padded to Margaret's boulder and did something she'd never seen a wild mountain lion do. He lay down at her feet. Margaret's throat closed tight. Her hand moved without thought, reaching toward the torn ear. Unega's eyes tracked the movement, but he didn't pull away. Her fingers touched the old scar tissue, thick and ridged under her fingertips. He closed his eyes and rumbled. Not a growl, something deeper. The same sound he'd made as a cub when she'd cleaned his wounds, half purr, half gratitude. "Mrs. Whitehorse?" Timothy's voice shook like leaves in wind. Is he purring?" A branch cracked upstream. Not a small sound, something heavy moving fast through the brush. Unega exploded to his feet, placing himself between Margaret and the sound. His growl now was different, protective, fierce. From the darkness between the trees, two golden eyes reflected the starlight. The female had arrived. The female mountain lion stood perfectly still at the tree line, smaller than Unega, but every muscle coiled tight as clock springs. Her coat was darker, marked with old scars across her haunches, claw marks from territorial fights maybe, or barbed wire from ranging too close to settlements. Behind her, barely visible in the underbrush, two shapes shifted like shadows given form. Cubs. Margaret's hand found Timothy's shoulder, pulled him against her side. The boy's whole body trembled like a leaf in a storm. Unega made a sound deep in his chest, not threatening, but communicating, a rumble that Margaret felt through the soles of her feet. The female's ears swiveled forward, then back, then forward again. She took one step into the clearing, belly low to the ground, then another, moving like water over stones. "Don't move," Margaret breathed into Timothy's ear. "Don't run." The female circled wide, keeping herself between them and her cubs. Unega moved too, maintaining position between Margaret and his mate. A careful dance, each step measured, purposeful. The cubs ventured forward, maybe 4 months old, oversized paws that they hadn't grown into yet, ears too big for their heads. One had Unega's tawny coloring, the other was dark like its mother, with white paws that flashed in the starlight. Timothy's breathing hitched, catching in his throat. The female's head snapped toward them, lips pulling back to show teeth white as fresh snow. "Shh!" Margaret's fingers pressed into Timothy's shoulder, feeling the bird bones beneath his thin shirt. "You're safe. I promise, you're safe." Unega moved then, brushing against his mate's flank with his shoulder. The female's snarl softened, but didn't disappear. She grabbed the nearest cub by the scruff. It went limp immediately, instinct taking over. And the second cub followed as she melted back into the forest, disappearing between one heartbeat and the next. Unega remained, watching Margaret with those golden eyes. His tail swept once across the ground, scattering pine needles. Then he too was gone, following his family into the darkness. Timothy's knees buckled. Margaret caught him, lowered him to sit on the creek bank. His face had gone white as bleached muslin. "You saw?" she asked. He nodded, unable to speak. "You understand what this means?" "Mr. Morrison," Timothy's voice cracked like thin ice. "He said $20 each for cubs." "Yes." "We can't let him." Margaret looked at the boy's fierce expression, jaw set stubborn despite his trembling. He reminded her of her own grandson, dead these 10 years from scarlet fever. Same determination, same pure heart. No, she agreed. We can't. They walked back in silence, Timothy's hand clutching hers tight enough to hurt. At her cabin door, she stopped him. Tell no one, not even your mother. I promise. She watched him run home, waiting until his front door closed before going inside. Sleep wouldn't come. She sat at her pine table, grinding willow bark with her pestle, planning. The sound of stone on stone filled the cabin, rhythmic as breathing. 4 a.m. came, dark as the inside of a grave. Margaret dressed in her husband's old canvas pants and coat, items she hadn't worn since his burial. The fabric smelled of cedar from the trunk, and underneath that, faintly, his tobacco. She tucked her skinning knife into her boot, the blade cold against her ankle. Filled a burlap sack with stones from her garden, each one the size of her fist. The town lay still as death. Even the saloon had closed, chairs stacked on tables visible through the dark windows. She moved along the back alleys, keeping to the deepest shadows, feet finding the quiet spots between gravel and broken glass. Morrison had been busy after sunset. She found his first trap behind the livery stable, a steel jaw trap, its teeth gleaming with fresh oil in the moonlight. The chain was staked deep into the ground with an iron rod driven down a good 2 feet. A chunk of venison sat in the center, positioned so an animal would have to step on the trigger plate to reach it. Margaret used a long stick to spring it. The metal jaws snapped shut with a sound like breaking bones, making her flinch. She reset it careful, but moved the meat to where it could be taken without triggering the mechanism. A smart cat would be suspicious, but a hungry one might risk it. The second trap waited near the schoolhouse. This one was different, a deadfall designed to crush. A log thick as her waist suspended by rope, rigged to drop when the bait stick was disturbed. The work of someone who knew their business. Her fingers worked in the darkness, adjusting the trigger stick's angle. Just a small change, but now it would take 3 times the pressure to release. No cat's weight would be enough. Maybe a bear, but nothing smaller. 5 more traps between the school and the church. She found them all, working by touch and moonlight, rendered them useless without making it obvious. Her knees ached from crouching. Her fingers had gone numb from the cold. The knife in her boot had rubbed a blister on her ankle. The eastern sky was starting to gray, that false dawn that came before the real thing, when she heard footsteps on gravel. Interesting morning for a walk. Sheriff Caldwell stood 10 feet away, hand resting on his pistol butt. His badge caught the first hint of dawn light. Margaret straightened slowly, joints popping like firewood. The burlap sack hung obvious in her hand, stones clicking together inside. I couldn't sleep. With rocks? He nodded at the sack. Planning to stone something? Wait, for exercise. My joints get stiff in the cold. Caldwell stepped closer. In the growing light, she could see the exhaustion carved into his face, lines deep as wagon ruts. Margaret, I've known you 7 years. You helped birth my daughter when she came breech and Doc was drunk. His voice was quiet, tired. But if you're interfering with Morrison's work, have you found any dead cats? No. Any attacks? No, but then what work am I interfering with? Caldwell's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping. He says the traps are being tampered with. Animals are clever. Maybe they're learning. Animals don't adjust trigger mechanisms. He moved closer, close enough she could smell the stale coffee on his breath. Animals don't move bait without springing traps. Margaret met his gaze steady. John, do you trust me? He sighed, suddenly looking older than his 40 years. I want to. But people are scared. And when people are scared, a woman's scream cut through the morning air, sharp as glass breaking. They both ran toward the sound, feet slapping on hard-packed earth. Main Street. A crowd already gathering near the church. Mrs. Patterson stood pointing at the church steps, one hand pressed to her mouth, the other shaking like she had palsy. Paw prints, fresh in the dust that had settled overnight. They led right up to the church doors, big as dinner plates. "It's the devil!" someone shouted. Sounded like old Mr. Henderson. "Come to mock God's house!" Morrison appeared from the hotel, fully dressed despite the hour, that buffalo rifle already in his hands. He studied the tracks, going down on one knee, then looked directly at Margaret. "These are less than an hour old." His pale eyes narrowed to slits. "Where were you an hour ago, Mrs. Whitehorse?" "With me," Caldwell said quickly. "We were talking." Morrison's smile was thin as paper. "All hour?" "Near enough." The hunter knelt by the tracks again, fingers tracing their edges gentle as a lover. "Male, same one from yesterday, but look here." He pointed to a smaller print, partially obscured by the males. "Female, too, and—" He stood, faced the crowd that had gathered thick as flies on honey. "Cubs! At least 2. The crowd erupted, voices crashing over each other, rising toward hysteria. "Whole pack of them! Surrounding the town! Kill them all!" Morrison raised his hand and the crowd quieted like schoolchildren. "I can handle this, but I need cooperation. No one goes out after dark. No one interferes with my traps." His eyes found Margaret again, cold as winter stars. "Anyone caught helping these animals will be considered an accomplice to whatever harm they cause." "That's not law," Margaret said, her voice carrying clear across the crowd. "It is now." Mayor Hutchins pushed through the crowd, his face red as raw beef. "I'm declaring an emergency. Morrison has full authority to protect this town." "Even if it means killing cubs?" The words escaped before Margaret could stop them. The crowd went silent as a held breath. "You're defending them!" Mrs. Johnson's voice rose shrill as a tea kettle. "You're actually defending monsters that could eat our children!" "I'm saying cubs aren't threats. They're babies." "Baby rattlesnakes still have venom," Morrison said, his voice flat. "Baby mountain lions still have teeth." "Listen to him," someone called. "He knows!" But not everyone was shouting agreement. Doc Hartley stood apart, frowning deep. Timothy's mother had her hand over her mouth. Sam Briggs from the general store looked uncomfortable as a man in church with muddy boots. "This is wrong," old Mrs. Chen said quietly from the edge of the crowd. She rarely spoke at town gatherings, her English still uncertain even after 15 years. "Killing babies brings bad fortune. The spirits remember." "Superstition," Patterson spat, but there was less force behind it. "Conscience," Margaret countered. The crowd split like an axe through wood. Those calling for blood, those uncertain. A few, like Mrs. Chen, openly disturbed. Morrison watched it all with those cold, pale eyes. Then he walked to Margaret, stood close enough that only she could hear. "I know you're protecting them. I can smell it on you. Wildcat and creek water." His breath was stale coffee and old tobacco. "I've hunted cats from here to Mexico. They're killers. Everyone." "You're wrong." "Am I?" He pulled something from his coat pocket. A photograph, creased and yellowed with age. A woman and a small girl, both smiling. "My wife, my daughter. 8 years ago, a mountain lion took my girl. Right from our yard in Kansas. We found pieces." Margaret's stomach turned over. The little girl had Morrison's pale eyes, his sharp chin. "So you tell me, Mrs. Whitehorse." His voice stayed soft, conversational, like they were discussing the weather. "What makes your cats different? What makes them worth saving?" She looked at the photograph. The child couldn't have been more than 5, holding a rag doll, missing her front teeth. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "But that wasn't these cats. That was hundreds of miles away, years ago." "They're all the same." He pocketed the photograph with careful hands. "And by tomorrow night, yours will be pelts on my wagon." He walked away, boots heavy on the ground. The crowd followed, still arguing among themselves. Margaret stood alone on the church steps, looking down at the paw prints in the dust. They led up to the door, then away toward the hills. But there, pressed into the soft earth beside the largest print, was something that made her blood turn to ice water. A boot print, fresh as the cat tracks, small, a child's boot. She recognized the tread pattern. She'd helped Timothy's mother patch that very boot last month. Timothy had been here, with the mountain lions. Margaret found Timothy behind his family's woodshed, knees pulled up to his chest, face streaked with dirt and tears. His boots were still damp with morning dew, that telltale tread pattern pressed into the soft ground around him. You went to them. Not a question. The boy's shoulders shook like he had fever chills. I wanted to warn them about Mr. Morrison's traps. Margaret crouched beside him, her knees grinding against the splintered wood of the shed wall. The smell of split pine and fear sweat clung to him thick as smoke. You led them to the church? No! His head snapped up, eyes red-rimmed. I followed them. They were already heading there. I think they were looking for you. His voice broke on the last word. The female kept sniffing the air, going toward your cabin. But then the church bells rang for early service and they spooked. Margaret's fingers found the boy's chin, lifted it gentle. Dirt smudged across his cheek like war paint. You could have been killed. But I wasn't. They knew me. The female, she smelled my hand. He held it out. No wounds, just dirt caked under the fingernails and a grass stain on his palm. She let me touch one of the cubs. It was soft, Mrs. Whitehorse, soft as cotton. The town hall bell began ringing. 3 sets of 3, emergency meeting. The sound bounced off the mountains like gunshots. Timothy, listen careful now. You tell no one about this, not even at the meeting. There's a meeting? Morrison called it. The whole town will be there. She stood, knees popping like dry kindling. Your mother will be looking for you. Go wash your face, change those boots. What are you going to do? She looked down at him, this boy with an old soul and young heart. What needs doing? The hall was already packed when Margaret arrived, thick with the smell of too many bodies and not enough air. Every bench full, people standing along the walls like they were holding them up. The morning sun slanted through windows, showing dust motes swirling like tiny storms. Morrison stood at the front beside Mayor Hutchins. His rifle leaned against the podium, that telescopic sight catching the light like a judging eye. Need to act now, Morrison was saying, his flat voice carrying over the crowd. These aren't ordinary mountain lions. They're showing signs of rabies. Margaret's stomach clenched hard as a fist. That's a lie. Every head turned toward her. The hall went quiet as a grave. Morrison's expression didn't change, carved from stone. Mrs. Whitehorse, good of you to join us. Rabid animals don't travel in family groups. She moved down the center aisle, each footfall loud on the pine boards. They don't avoid humans for days. They don't leave clean tracks in straight lines. You some kind of expert now? Patterson called out from his bench. More than someone who sees rabies where there is none. She reached the front, turned to face the crowd. All those faces she'd known for 7 years. Some kind, some suspicious, all afraid. Ask him. Ask Morrison if he's seen any actual signs of disease, foaming, aggression, daylight activity without purpose. Morrison's jaw tightened just a hair. The female showed aggression this morning when... When what? When you weren't there to see it? The tracks show curiosity, nothing more. Margaret's hands were steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. John, you were there. Did those tracks show any sign of stalking, hunting behavior? Sheriff Caldwell shifted uncomfortable on his bench, hat turning in his hands. They went straight to the church, and straight away. Like they were searching for something, Margaret said. Or someone. The crowd murmured, the sound like wind through wheat. Enough of this. Morrison picked up his rifle, not pointing it, but holding it ready. I've been hired to do a job. I'll have those cats by nightfall, with or without your approval. No. The word came out harder than Margaret intended, echoing off the walls. You want to tell these people why you're protecting those animals? Morrison's pale eyes narrowed. Or should I? Margaret's throat went dry as August dust. She looked at the faces watching her, neighbors, folks she'd helped birth babies for, set bones for, sat with through fever and grief. Timothy sat with his mother near the back, his clean face shining with hope. 5 years ago, she began, her voice rough as burlap, I found a young mountain lion in a trap. Someone gasped, sounded like Mrs. Patterson. His back leg was nearly severed, bone showing through like white sticks. He should have attacked when I approached. Any wild animal would have. She pulled up her left sleeve, revealing the parallel scars, white against her weathered skin. He did this, but only once, when I tried to cut him free. Doc Hartley stood, moved closer, his bad leg dragging slightly. May I? She held out her arm. His fingers traced the scars with professional interest, gentle as handling eggs. These are old, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. 5 years, maybe 6, and they match. Claw marks from a large cat, but... He looked up at the crowd. Not deep. Defensive, not aggressive. You saved it? Mrs. Chen asked from her corner, voice soft as silk. Margaret nodded. Cut him free. Brought him to my cabin. The wound was infected, full of rot. I thought he'd die. You should have let him, Morrison said, cold as January. I'm a healer. I don't let things die when I can help it. She looked at Morrison straight on. He was maybe 8 months old, still had spots on his legs like a fawn. His ear was torn, infected. The leg... She paused, remembering the smell of infection, the heat of fever under her hands. Took 3 months to heal. You kept a mountain lion for 3 months? Mayor Hutchins' voice cracked like a boy's. In my barn. Fed him venison I bought from hunters. Sang to him when the fever made him cry. Her fingers went to the medicine pouch at her hip. Cherokee lullabies my grandmother taught me. For babies with colic, children with bad dreams. This is madness. Patterson stood up, face red as raw meat. You're telling us you tamed a mountain lion? No, I healed one. There's a difference. She turned to face the crowd fully. When he was strong enough, I opened the barn door. He left. I thought I'd never see him again. But you have, Timothy's mother said softly from her bench. That's why you've been going to the creek. Margaret met her eyes. Yes. And now it's back with a mate and cubs, Morrison said, setting his rifle butt on the floor with a sharp crack. A whole family of predators you've taught not to fear humans. They still fear you. They fear the guns, the traps, the shouting. Margaret's voice gained strength. But they remember kindness, too. Yesterday at the creek, that lion, Unega I called him, he took meat from my hand, gentle as a lamb. Lions aren't lambs, someone shouted from the back. No, but they're not demons either. She looked at the crowd, seeing the divide growing wider, fear on one side, uncertainty on the other. They came to town looking for me, that's all, looking for the one human who showed them mercy. Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat, the sound like gravel rolling. Margaret, even if what you say is true, it is true. Timothy stood up from beside his mother, face red as sunset, but voice steady. I saw it last night. His mother grabbed his arm. Timothy, what? Mrs. Whitehorse took me to the creek to teach me about... He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing. About not fearing things just because they're different. The mountain lion came, the male. He ate from her hand. He let her touch his ear, the torn one. And when the female came with the cubs, he protected Mrs. Whitehorse, stood between her and his own mate. You took a child to see those beasts? Mrs. Johnson's voice pitched high as a hawk's cry. She kept me safe, Timothy said, louder now. They both did. The lion, he knew I was there. Could have hurt me easy, but he just watched. made sure I wasn't a threat to Mrs. Whitehorse. The crowd erupted, voices crashing together like rapids over rocks. Child endangerment! Proves they're not normal! Should arrest her! Mayor Hutchins banged his gavel hard enough to crack the podium. Order! Order! I've heard enough. Morrison shouldered his rifle, the metal cold and final. These animals are corrupted, made unnatural by human interference. That makes them more dangerous, not less. How? Margaret asked. They'll come to towns expecting food, and when they don't get it, or when they encounter someone who smells of fear instead of foolish kindness, they'll attack. His pale eyes found hers. It's not if, it's when. Unega has had 5 years to do that, has he? Morrison's smile was thin as paper. Not yet. The female has cubs, Mrs. Chen said quietly. In my country, we believe killing a mother brings curse. The babies starve slow, their spirits restless. Bad fortune follows. Superstition, Patterson said, but his voice had lost its edge. Doc Hartley cleared his throat. There's something else to consider. These cats know Margaret. Trust her. Could she? He paused, choosing words careful as picking glass from a wound. Could she lead them away? Back to the deep mountains? Hope flickered in some faces. Fear hardened in others. And if they come back? Morrison asked. They won't, Margaret said. Not if I go far enough. Not if I explain. Explain? Morrison laughed, short and harsh. To animals? To creatures that remember kindness, that understand pattern and routine. She looked at the crowd. Give me 2 days. Let me try. You'd do that? Mrs. Brennan asked. Leave them in the wilderness? Margaret thought of Unega's weight against her legs, the rumble of contentment in his chest, the female's fierce protection of her cubs, the tracks leading to the church, searching for something familiar in a world gone strange. Yes. Morrison set down his rifle with a crack that made everyone jump. No. Everyone turned to him. I was hired to bring in pelts. That's what I'll do. He pulled out a piece of paper from his coat. Contract. Signed by the mayor. Legally binding. Hutchins looked sick as spoiled milk. Jake, if she can lead them away safely. Contract says eliminate the threat. Period. Morrison's pale eyes fixed on Margaret. But I'll give you this. You want to try your way? Fine. You can come with me. You lead them out, or I hunt them down. But if those cats show any aggression, any danger to this town, I take my shots. That's fair, Caldwell said quickly. Too quickly. Margaret looked at the sheriff, at the crowd. Some faces showed relief, others disappointment. They wanted blood, wanted something to pay for their fear. When? She asked Morrison. Dawn tomorrow. You lead them out, or I hunt them down. I need tonight, to prepare, to gather what they'll follow. No, you've had enough time to. A scream cut through his words like an axe through pine. From outside, young, terrified. Everyone rushed for the doors, pushing, shoving, panic thick as smoke. In the street, Emma Hutchins stood frozen as a fence post, pointing at the roof of the general store. The female mountain lion crouched on the peak, a cub dangling from her mouth by its scruff. The second cub clung to her back, tiny claws dug into her fur. In the full morning sun, her coat gleamed like old brass. Morrison's rifle swung up, smooth as water. The female looked directly at Margaret, and in those golden eyes, Margaret saw something that stopped her heart cold. Recognition. And behind it, desperate pleading. Blood matted the fur on the female's haunch, fresh, red as paint. She'd been shot. Morrison's finger curled around the trigger, knuckle going white. No! Margaret lunged forward, struck the rifle barrel with her open palm. The gun swung wide as it fired. The bullet sparked off the store's tin roof, the sound sharp as breaking glass. The female mountain lion flinched, but didn't run. Blood dripped from her haunch onto the wooden shingles. 3 drops. 4. Dark red against weathered wood, spreading like spilled ink. Morrison shoved Margaret aside, hard. She hit the dirt, gravel biting through her dress into her hip. Dust filled her mouth, tasting of iron and drought. "Interfering with lawful," Morrison started. A roar cut through his words. Not from the roof. From the alley between the bank and the barber shop. Unega stepped into Main Street. In full daylight, he was massive. Lord have mercy, how had she forgotten how big he'd gotten? Shoulders rolling with each step, head low, that torn ear flat against his skull. His lips pulled back, showing fangs yellow as old piano keys. The sound coming from his chest was deeper than thunder, felt it through the ground, through her bones. Morrison swung the rifle toward him, smooth as a weather vane in wind. Unega didn't charge. He walked. Each paw deliberate, placed careful as a man testing rotten floorboards. His golden eyes locked on Morrison, never blinking, never wavering. "Everyone back!" Caldwell shouted, but nobody moved. Frozen like they'd turned to salt, watching death pad down their street on silent paws, muscles rolling under that tawny coat like water under ice. Margaret pushed herself up, dirt in her mouth, copper taste of blood where she'd bitten her tongue. Her ribs ached where she'd hit the ground, sharp pain with each breath. "Don't shoot him!" "Stay down," Morrison said, not looking at her. The rifle tracked Unega's movement, steady as a compass needle finding north. The mountain lion stopped 30 feet away. His tail swept once across the dirt. Twice. Muscles bunched in his haunches, coiling like springs. On the roof, the female tried to stand. Her back leg buckled, folding under her like wet paper. The cub on her back mewed, thin, desperate, the sound a baby makes when it's hungry and scared. She looked at Margaret again, then began limping along the roof's peak toward the back of the building, leaving a trail of blood drops like breadcrumbs. "The female's leaving," someone whispered. Sounded like Sam Briggs. Morrison kept the rifle on Unega. 2 shots, first him, then her. Margaret stood. Her legs shook like a newborn colt's, but she stood. "You'll have to shoot through me." "Margaret, don't." Caldwell reached for her, fingers brushing her sleeve. She walked forward, each step measured, the way her grandmother had taught her to approach a spooked horse. Slow, visible, no sudden movements. "Get back," Morrison said, his voice tight as new wire. She kept walking, past Caldwell, past the townspeople pressed against storefronts, into that space between Morrison's rifle and Unega, that deadly gap where bullet would meet flesh. The mountain lion's growl deepened, vibrating through the air like a saw through wood. But his eyes, his golden eyes, shifted to her face. "Hello, old friend," she said in Cherokee, the words rough in her dry throat. Then in English, "I've missed you." Unega's good ear swiveled forward. The growl softened but didn't stop, like distant thunder that wouldn't quite fade. Margaret held out her hand. Empty, palm up. The same hand that had fed him, healed him, touched his torn ear 100 times. "Mrs. Whitehorse, move!" Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "I have a clear shot if you—" "Then take it." She didn't turn around. "Shoot through me. Show everyone what kind of man you are." Behind her, she heard the crowd shifting, feet shuffling in dirt. Someone was crying. Emma Hutchins, probably, still terrified from seeing the cats. But other sounds too, murmuring, people moving. Unega took 1 step forward. Another. The growl faded to a rumble in his chest. 20 feet. 15. 10. Margaret could smell him now. Wild musk and pine sap and something metallic. Blood, but not his. The female's blood on him, from trying to help her maybe. Or from their mating. "That's it," she whispered. "You remember. I know you remember." 5 feet. She could see scars she hadn't noticed at the creek. A gash across his nose healed white as salt. Puncture marks on his shoulder. Another cat's bite. Territorial fight. 5 years of surviving written on his body in the language of wounds. "He's going to kill her!" Mrs. Johnson's voice, high and thin. "Shoot!" someone else screamed. "For God's sake, shoot it!" Morrison's breathing was audible, harsh as a bellows. The rifle barrel wavered just slightly. Unega stopped directly in front of Margaret. This close, his head reached her chest. He could open her throat with one swipe, crush her skull with those jaws, take her down before Morrison could squeeze the trigger. Instead, he pressed his massive head against her stomach. The sound that came from him wasn't quite purr, wasn't quite growl, something between. The same sound he'd made as a young cat when she'd cleaned his infected wounds, when fever made him weak as water. Recognition. Relief. Coming home. Margaret's hand found his torn ear, the scar tissue thick under her fingers, ridged and rough. He pushed harder against her, nearly knocking her backward. "I know," she murmured in Cherokee, then English. "I know. You were looking for me." "Dear God in heaven," Doc Hartley breathed. Margaret glanced back. The whole town stood frozen, watching. Morrison still had the rifle raised, but his face had gone white as flour. Behind him, Timothy was pushing through the crowd. "Don't!" his mother grabbed for him. "Timothy, no!" But the boy ducked under her arm, ran forward fast as his legs could carry him. "Timothy, stop!" Caldwell shouted. The boy didn't stop. He ran straight to Margaret and Unega, skidding to a halt in the dirt just out of reach. His chest heaved like a bellows. Sweat ran down his face, cutting tracks through dust. "The female!" he gasped. "She's behind the store. She collapsed. The blood." Unega's head lifted. He looked at Timothy, then at Margaret, then toward the store where his mate had disappeared. "Show me," Margaret said. Timothy turned and ran. Margaret followed. Behind her she heard Unega's paws on packed earth following. "Don't you move!" Morrison shouted. "Any of you!" But others were following now. Doc Hartley with his medical bag bumping against his bad leg. Mrs. Chen moving quick despite her age. Even Caldwell, hand on his pistol but not drawn. Behind the store, the female lay on her side in the dust. The cubs huddled against her belly, mewing constant thin cries. Blood pooled under her haunch. The bullet had gone deep. Margaret could see that from 10 feet away. Maybe hit bone. Her breathing was shallow, too fast. Margaret dropped to her knees beside the cat. The female's lips pulled back, showing teeth. But she was too weak for more than that. "Doc, I need your bag." Hartley hesitated, standing there with his mouth open. "Margaret, I can't. Not for you to do. For me. Just open it." The crowd had followed, forming a half circle at a safe distance. Morrison pushed through, rifle ready. Unega placed himself between Morrison and the female. Not aggressive, just there. Solid as a mountain, immovable as stone. Margaret's hands moved through Hartley's bag. Gauze, alcohol, needle and thread. Tools she knew like her own fingers. "This is insane," Morrison said. "It's a wild animal." "She's a mother." Margaret poured alcohol on her hands, the sharp smell cutting through the scent of blood and fear sweat. "Timothy, I need you to hold the cubs." "What?" "They need to be kept calm and away while I work. Can you do that?" Timothy nodded, quick as a bird. He scooped up both cubs, one in each arm. They squirmed, but didn't scratch. One started purring, a tiny motor sound that seemed impossible from something so small. Margaret bent over the female. The wound was bad. The bullet had entered the big muscle of the haunch, traveled down. Still in there. She could feel it under the skin like a stone. "She needs the bullet out," she said to no one in particular. "You can't be serious," Patterson said from the crowd. Margaret looked up at them all, at their faces. Fear, disgust, fascination, wonder. "5 years ago, you trusted me to save your children from lung fever. Trust me now." She turned back to the female, placed one hand on the cat's side. The breathing was getting worse, more labored. "Unega," she said softly. The male mountain lion padded over, lay down facing his mate. He made that rumbling sound again, deeper now. The female's eyes, glazed with pain, focused on him. Margaret's fingers found the bullet, lodged against bone. The female jerked, tried to rise. Unega placed one massive paw on her shoulder, gentle, but holding her down. "Now," Margaret whispered to herself, and pulled. The bullet came free with a wet sound that made her stomach turn. Blood flowed fresh, bright red. Margaret packed gauze against it, pressed hard. The female yowled, a sound that raised every hair on Margaret's arms. "I need to stitch this," Margaret said. "It'll hurt." The female's golden eyes found Margaret's face. In them, Margaret saw the same thing she'd seen in Unega's eyes 5 years ago. Not trust exactly, but a willingness to endure. An understanding that this pain might lead to something better. The needle went in. The female's whole body tensed, muscles hard as rope. But she didn't fight. Unega stayed pressed against her, that rumble constant now, vibrating through the ground. The cubs in Timothy's arms responded with their own tiny purrs. 6 stitches. 8. 10. Each one careful, precise. There. Margaret sat back on her heels. Blood covered her hands to the wrists, soaked into her dress. She needs rest, water, food. "You're not serious," Morrison said. "You're not actually suggesting we nurse a wounded mountain lion." Margaret stood, turned to face him. Behind Morrison, the entire town watched. Every soul in Cedar Ridge seemed like. "I'm suggesting we show mercy." "Mercy?" Morrison's laugh was bitter as black coffee. "For killers?" "Look at them." Margaret pointed to Unega, curled around his mate like a shield. To the cubs in Timothy's arms, purring against his chest. "Do they look like killers to you?" Morrison raised the rifle. Yes. The click of him cocking it was loud as a church bell. But then other sounds. Footsteps, small ones. Children pushing through the crowd. Emma Hutchins first, her face still streaked with tears but jaw set stubborn. Then James Patterson. Then more school children, forming a line between Morrison and the cats. "Stop," Emma said, her small voice clear as spring water. "Please stop." "Get those children back," Morrison shouted. But more were coming. Mrs. Chen's grandchildren, the Murphy twins, even teenager Ben Hartley, the doctor's son. They stood there, a wall of small bodies between Morrison's gun and the mountain lion family. "Move!" Morrison's voice cracked like a whip. "No," Timothy said from where he knelt with the cubs. "We won't let you." Morrison swung the rifle toward the crowd of adults. "Control your children!" But the parents stood frozen. Mrs. Brennan had her hand over her mouth. Mrs. Patterson was crying silent tears. Even Mayor Hutchins seemed unable to speak, his face gray as ash. It was Sheriff Caldwell who finally moved. He walked forward slow, placed his hand on Morrison's rifle barrel, and pushed it down, gentle but firm. "Enough," he said quiet. "It's done. Your contract is void." Hutchins found his voice, though it shook. "The threat has been resolved." Morrison looked at the mountain lions, at the children, at Margaret with her bloodied hands. Something passed over his face, not quite defeat, something else. "This is a mistake," he said, voice flat as hammered tin. "When someone dies, remember I warned you." He turned and walked away, bootfalls heavy, deliberate. His footsteps echoed off the buildings, fading toward the hotel. Margaret knelt back beside the female. The cat's breathing had steadied some. The bleeding had stopped, though the wound would need watching. "We'll need to move them," she said, "somewhere safe while she heals." "The old barn," Sam Briggs said, surprising everyone. "My old barn north of town. It's empty, dry, got a good roof." Margaret nodded, exhausted down to her bones. "We'll need a wagon, careful transport." "I'll get mine," Turner said, and Margaret realized it was the first time he'd spoken since this all started. His face was pale as milk, but his voice was steady. As the crowd dispersed to gather supplies, Timothy approached with the cubs. They were falling asleep in his arms, tiny bellies full of trust and warmth. "Mrs. Whitehorse," he whispered. "Look." She looked where he pointed. Unega had stretched out full length beside his mate, one paw draped protectively over her injured haunch. His eyes were closed, but his torn ear tracked every sound, every movement. For the first time in 5 years, he was completely relaxed, trusting them to keep watch, trusting her. Margaret's vision blurred. She wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, smearing blood across her face. That's when she saw Morrison, standing in the shadow of the hotel porch, watching. The rifle was still in his hands, and he was smiling. 3 weeks. That's how long the female needed before she could walk without her leg folding under her like wet cardboard. Margaret changed the bandages every morning in Sam Briggs' old barn. The smell of old hay and mouse droppings mixed with the wild musk of mountain cats. First day, the female had snarled, lips pulled back to show every tooth. 4th day, just a rumble in her chest. 10th day, she lay still while Margaret's hands moved over the wound, checking for heat, for swelling, for the rot that could still kill her. Now Margaret stood in the barn doorway watching Timothy feed the cubs scraps of venison. They'd grown in 3 weeks, bodies longer, ears more proportional to their heads. The female rested in clean straw Briggs had brought special. Unega beside her, always beside her, that torn ear tracking every sound. Morning light slanted through gaps in the boards, painting gold stripes across their fur like bars of a cage made of sunlight. "She's ready," Doc Hartley said behind her. He'd been checking the wound daily, his curiosity overcoming the fear that still made his hand shake when he got too close. "The muscles knitted well. She can travel." Margaret nodded. Her throat felt thick like she'd swallowed pine pitch. Footsteps outside on the gravel. Sheriff Caldwell appeared with Mayor Hutchins and half the town council. They stayed back from the door, none of them looking direct at the cats. "Margaret," Hutchins said, "we've been discussing." She turned to face them, noting how they shifted their weight, nervous as horses before a storm. "The town wants them gone," she said, not a question. "The town wants them safe," Caldwell corrected, fidgeting with his hat. "Away from here, yes, but safe." Hutchins pulled out a rolled paper from his coat, the parchment crackling. "We've drawn up boundaries. The high valleys, from Eagle Peak to Carson Ridge, 2,000 acres, maybe more. We're declaring it protected land." Margaret took the paper. Her hands trembled slightly, making the parchment shake. "Protected?" "No hunting, no trapping, not even for deer or rabbits. Violators will be prosecuted." Hutchins cleared his throat, the sound rough. "It was Mrs. Chen's idea. She said kindness shown returns threefold." "The town council voted?" "Unanimous," he paused. "Even Patterson agreed, after what he saw with the children." Margaret looked back at the cats. Unega was grooming the female's good ear with long strokes of his tongue, gentle as a mother with a newborn. "I'll take them tomorrow," she said. "Dawn." "Alone?" Caldwell frowned, those lines around his eyes going deeper. "That's 2 days' journey to the high valleys. Hard terrain." "I'll go with her." Everyone turned. Morrison stood in the barn entrance, but different somehow. No rifle. First time since he'd arrived, he wasn't carrying that buffalo gun. "You?" Margaret couldn't hide the surprise in her voice. "You saved that female clean. Professional work." He stepped inside, still keeping distance from the cats, but not as much as before. "I was wrong about them being corrupted. They're just devoted. To each other. To you." His pale eyes found hers. Something had changed in them, like ice starting to thaw. "My daughter would have liked that," he said quiet. "Seeing creatures care for each other. She was like that with her dolls, her kittens, always tending something." Margaret studied his face. The hard lines around his mouth had softened. "Why help us?" "Because hate is heavy cargo." His hand went to his chest where that photograph lived in his pocket. 8 years is long enough to carry it. Maybe it's time to carry something else. Dawn came gray and cool, mist hanging in the valleys like wool. The whole town gathered on Main Street, some to say goodbye, others to make sure the cats truly left. Turner's wagon waited, reinforced with extra boards, fresh straw in the bed. The female climbed in on her own, the cubs scrambling after her. She was alert now, golden eyes tracking everything, but calm. 3 weeks of regular food and safety had filled her out, her coat glossy even in the gray light. Uniga paced alongside the wagon, occasionally jumping up to touch noses with his mate, that rumbling purr audible from 10 feet away. Margaret climbed onto the driver's bench. The wood was cold through her dress, damp with dew. Morrison swung up beside her. He'd brought a different gun, just a regular Winchester, not that long-range killer. For protection, he said at Margaret's look. Wolves in those mountains. Bears waking up hungry from winter. You'll need it. Timothy ran up, pressed something into Margaret's hand, a small leather pouch warm from his pocket. Tobacco, he whispered. For offerings, like you taught me. And he pulled out something else. A small wooden carving, rough but recognizable. A mountain lion, sitting. I made it, so you remember. She squeezed his shoulder, feeling the bird bones beneath his shirt. Take care of my garden. Remember what I showed you about the feverfew. 1 finger deep for the seeds. Every morning, water when the soil's dry, 1 knuckle deep. Harvest the leaves before they flower. The wagon lurched forward, wheels creaking on the rutted road, each bump making the female tense. Behind them, Cedar Ridge grew smaller, the building shrinking to toy size. Ahead the mountains rose purple and vast, snow still clinging to the peaks, though spring had come to the valleys. The first day passed in careful travel. Morrison walked ahead, scouting for washouts, for spots where the wagon might mire. Margaret drove slow, mindful of the female's wound. Every hour she stopped to check the bandage, to offer water. Unega never strayed more than 10 feet from the wagon, that torn ear constantly swiveling. They camped by Willow Creek, the same spot where Margaret had first reunited with Unega. While Morrison built a fire, efficient, no wasted movement, Margaret carried water to the female. The cat drank deeply, then surprised Margaret by licking her hand. Once. Rough tongue scraping skin like sandpaper. She's thanking you, Morrison said quietly from beside the fire. How do you know? I've hunted cats for 15 years, studied them, learned them. He poked the fire with a stick, sparks rising like fireflies. They don't show affection lightly. Takes trust. He paused. Takes recognition of kindness. The cubs were playing now, pouncing on shadows the fire threw. One stalked Morrison's boot, batting at the lace. Morrison went still as stone. The cub climbed into his lap, kneading with tiny paws before curling up. Morrison's hands hovered, not touching. I can't. You don't have to do anything, Margaret said. Just be still. They sat in silence while stars emerged, first one, then dozens, then countless. The cub slept in Morrison's lap, purring like a tiny engine. He never moved, not even when his leg must have gone numb. My daughter, he said sudden, voice rough. She would have been 13 now. She wanted to be a veterinarian. Said she'd fix all the hurt animals in the world. Margaret said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only kindness you could offer. The second day brought them into the high country. Pine forest gave way to aspen groves, the white trunks like bones. The air thinned, sharpened, each breath cold in the lungs. Snow still lay in the shadows, though spring had come to the valleys below. Here, Morrison said, stopping at a meadow bisected by a stream running fast with snowmelt. Good water, deer trails everywhere, see? He pointed to paths through the grass, worn down to dirt. Cave systems in those cliffs for denning, protection from winter storms. Margaret stopped the wagon. The female stood immediately, testing her leg. Strong enough, the limp barely noticeable. Margaret climbed down, her joints stiff from the cold, and opened the wagon's back gate. The female leaped out, graceful despite the healing wound. Cubs tumbled after her, landing in the grass, immediately starting to explore. The female stood in the meadow grass, head high, nostrils flaring as she pulled in the scents. Pine, snow, prey animals, freedom. Unega joined her. They touched noses, a long moment of connection. Then both looked back at Margaret. "Go on," she said, though her voice cracked. "This is your home now." The female moved first, picked up one cub by the scruff, started toward the tree line where the aspens grew thick. The second cub followed, bounding through grass tall as its back. But Unega stayed. He patted to Margaret, pressed against her legs hard enough to stagger her backward. That rumbling purr vibrated through her bones, through her chest, settling somewhere near her heart. Her hands found his torn ear one last time, the scar tissue rough and familiar under her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered in Cherokee, "for trusting me, for coming back, for showing them that we're not all dangerous." He pulled away, looked at her with those golden eyes that had watched her for 5 years, even when she couldn't see him, then turned and followed his family into the forest. Margaret watched until the last flash of tawny fur vanished among the white aspens. "They'll be all right," Morrison said. "Yes." "You'll miss them." "Yes." They stood together in the emptied meadow. Wind moved through the grass with a sound like whispers. Somewhere high above, a hawk called, the sound echoing off the cliffs. "We should go," Morrison said. "Long way back." Margaret climbed onto the wagon bench. As Morrison took the reins, she looked back once more. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and wilderness stretching forever. But then, movement. High on a granite outcrop that caught the afternoon sun, Unega stood silhouetted against the sky, watching them leave. Protecting. Making sure they were truly going. Margaret raised her hand. The mountain lion remained motionless for a heartbeat, maybe 2. Then, he was gone. Cedar Ridge looked smaller when they returned. Or maybe Margaret had grown larger in the mountains, expanded somehow. Timothy waited at her cabin, the garden perfectly tended. Every row straight, the feverfew already sprouting, tiny green shoots pushing through dark soil. Did they? They're home. The boy's face split into a grin that showed his gap tooth, then grew serious. Will we see them again? No. Never? Margaret knelt, bringing herself to his eye level. Dust from the road still clung to her dress. That's the gift we gave them, a life without us, wild and free and safe. Morrison left the next morning on the dawn stage. Before boarding, he handed Margaret a leather tube. "Maps," he said. "Every water source, cave, game trail in those mountains. Marked it all when I was scouting. In case," he shrugged, "in case you need to know they're all right." She never opened them. Summer came hot and dry. The town council posted signs at the boundary of the protected land. Wildlife sanctuary. No hunting, no trapping. By order of Cedar Ridge. Patterson himself nailed up the first one, hammering like he was driving truth into wood. Margaret taught Timothy and the other children about medicinal plants, how to read animal signs in the dirt, how to move through the forest without disturbing it, quiet as shadows. Fear comes from not understanding, she told them, standing in the same spot where Unega had faced down Morrison's rifle. When you understand something, you can choose fear or respect, hate or acceptance. Emma Hutchins raised her small hand. What about love? Margaret smiled, the first real smile in weeks. Love is the hardest choice. It means letting go. One evening, as autumn painted the aspens gold, they'd be gold in the high valleys, too. Timothy found her sitting on her porch, looking toward the mountains. Do you think they remember us? Margaret thought of Unega's weight against her legs, the female's tongue on her hand, the cubs purring in Morrison's lap, Morrison himself, choosing to help instead of hunt. Memory isn't just thought, she said. It's in the body, in scars and healing, in the way we move through the world differently because of what we've touched. She stood, joints creaking like old wood. Come, let me show you how to prepare willow bark for winter fevers. They walked to her medicine room, Timothy following close. On the shelf, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the bone needle, still stained with old blood, still sharp. "What's that?" Timothy asked. "A reminder," Margaret said. "That healing leaves marks on everyone involved." Outside, wind moved down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and snow and wildness. So much wildness. Somewhere up there, in caves Margaret would never see, cubs were learning to hunt. A female was teaching them caution and courage in equal measure. A scarred male was marking territory, keeping his family safe, living, free, without her. As she began teaching Timothy about willow bark, how to strip it, dry it, measure it, a sound drifted down from the mountains. So faint she might have imagined it. A mountain lion's call. Deep, echoing. Then another, answering. Higher pitched, female. Then, almost too soft to hear, two smaller voices joining in. Margaret smiled and kept teaching. Timothy's eyes had gone wide, but he didn't speak. He understood. Some gifts were too precious for words. The moon rose full and white over Cedar Ridge. In the distance, the mountains stood dark against stars numerous as the promises we make and break, and sometimes, if we're very lucky, keep. Connecting Hearts, I told you this story because I needed you to understand something that took me 70 years to learn. When Margaret stood between Morrison's rifle and that mountain lion, she wasn't just protecting an animal. She was protecting the part of ourselves that still believes mercy matters more than fear. Every town, every family faces that moment when we choose between what's easy and what's right. Morrison came to Cedar Ridge to kill, but he left carrying something lighter than hate. The children who stood between his gun and those cubs, they're grandparents now, still telling this story. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to be afraid of something just because it's different. That's what Margaret taught us. That's what Unega knew. Love means letting go. But kindness? Kindness comes back to you. Sometimes with golden eyes and a torn ear, asking you to remember who you really are. Disclaimer. This story was inspired by historical accounts of human-wildlife interactions in the American frontier, created solely for entertainment purposes. It does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior toward humans or animals. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination. Any resemblance to real persons living or dead, or actual events, is purely coincidental. Wild animals are dangerous and should never be approached. This work explores themes of compassion and coexistence through fiction, not as guidance for wildlife interaction.